Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to make a medical calculator which works out the patient's score of something called SIRS. So SIRS stands for Systemic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. But in the process of writing this code, we're also going to learn a lot of important things about writing the code. We're going to learn about variables, we're going to learn about different data types, we're going to learn how to write while loops, if loops, try and except statements, and we're also going to learn how to prompt a user to input their own information. This is the first video in a series of coding medical applications, and the priority with this video and other videos in this series is that I'm going to be teaching you how to actually make something useful and make something that actually does something, and we're specifically going to be looking at medical applications. Now what that means is that times I'll probably go a bit quickly and won't necessarily explain all of the details. Even if you're not familiar with the concepts, don't worry too much about that. I would say focus on trying to get it to work. Over time you'll build up a bit of an understanding of exactly how these things work and what some of the different components are, if they're not entirely clear for you at first. But in my opinion, it's fine initially just to sort of be copying the code that I'm writing here and using a similar sort of template, which you can then modify, and by modifying it, you'll start to learn how the code works and that sort of thing. Now, as I said, for our example, we're going to be writing code to calculate a SIRS score, but at the end of the video, I'm going to challenge you to write your own calculator for a different medical scoring system or a non-medical scoring system. I would highly recommend trying to code along because I think the best way to learn is actually just to do it. And if you are interested in coding along, the easiest ways to get set up, if you don't already have an environment set up on your computer, would be to either get something called Google Colab, which is in the browser and you can just code directly into it, or something called Jupyter Notebook, which you can download onto your computer. I'm going to share links for both of those in the description with some great videos that explain how to get set up and how to use those. There's also an accompanying blog post for this video that again explains everything step by step, so feel free to watch the video or use the blog or use them both at the same time. So now let's get into writing the code. I'm personally going to use a Jupyter Notebook, and the first thing we want to do is make a new Python 3 file, and this is the script that this is the notebook where we're going to write all our code into. And as I said, we're going to make a SIRS calculator, so let's call our notebook SIRS calculator, and let's just write a nice print statement at the start which introduces people to the calculator. So in Python, let's just write print welcome to the SIRS calculator. Okay, and that's just going to return us here in what's called the console, which is just going to print back exactly what the message is that we write in. And we're going to need to define a variable which we're going to put in our score, so our SIRS score, which is going to be kind of a running count that we're going to add up throughout the notebook. So let's call that SIRS score, and let's give it a score of 0. Now we want to go through each of the different categories for the SIRS and calculate a score. So firstly, we have temperature, and the way that we're going to do this is we're going to use what's called a while loop. And basically what this loop does is, while the statement contained within it is true, it will just keep on doing everything within that loop. So let me show you to explain that. So let's say I set x equal to 1, and I say that while x is equal to 1, print hello. Now this is going to create what's called an infinite loop. And essentially it will just keep printing hello forever because x is currently equal to 1 and it's not changing, so it's just going to keep on going. And I can interact that on my keyboard if I double tap I, and then that will stop. But essentially that's what the idea behind a while loop is. As long as that statement's true, it will just keep on going. So we are actually going to stick with that, and we're going to say while true, forgive my typing here, there we go, while true. And essentially what this is an infinite loop, and then at some point we're going to break it by using a break statement. But we'll come up to that in a minute. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask the person using this function, what is the current temperature? So we're going to define a variable, which we're going to call temperature. And basically what a variable is it's just something that stores a value. So here we've already defined a variable, which was the SIRS score, and we let that equal to 1. Temperature, we want that to equal the value of the person's temperature. And we're going to call it temp for short, and usually when you're defining a variable, you'll keep it quite short. But we're going to ask the user to input that information. And so we're going to use something called the input function. And what the input function does is it sends a message, it prints out a statement for the person using it, and whatever I put in here it will say, and whatever you answer will then get put to this value temp. So if we put as the input statement, what is the patient's temperature? Now what's going to happen, so let me just demonstrate that outside of this loop. So if we say temp equals this, it's going to say what is the patient's temperature, and if I say 37, that is now stored temp as 37. So then if we call temp, it will come back with 37. So we've now got the value of temp, but actually we're not done yet, because what's important is that temp is of the appropriate type, because we're going to look if the temperature is above 38.5 or below 37.5. And in order to do that, temp needs to be a number. Now, in coding language, a number is either an integer or a float. An integer is a whole number, and a float is a number with a decimal place. And for any variable that we've defined, we can check what type that variable is in Python by using the type function. So we just put type, and then we put the name of the variable inside it. And you will see that temp is currently an str, and what str stands for is a string, whereas we actually want it to be a float or an integer, an int. So here for the serve score, we've defined that as equaling 0. Now, because we've set it 0, that means that it's actually an int. So what should happen here, if we go type and then we go with serve score, it should tell us that it is an integer or an int. And if we gave it a decimal place, we said 0.0, and then we asked what type it was, it's going to come back as a float. So it's important that we make temperature the right type, and that's what we're now going to do within this loop. So the way that we're going to do that is with a try except statement, and what that involves is we write try, and we are going to try to turn temp into a float of temp. So when it was typed in as 37 and it became a string, this function of float now converts that string into a float. However, if it's not able to convert it into a float, if it's not able to convert it into a number, then it will throw up an error. Because if I wrote fk, for example, and tried to turn that into a float, it wouldn't work. So then we will add an except statement, and it's going to be except value error. And essentially, what will happen here is if it tries to convert temperature into a float and it's not able to, then it will come back with this value error, and whatever's in this loop will then happen. So we're actually then going to print out a statement saying that was not a number, or let's say please enter a number. Let's go with that was not a valid number. Please enter a number. And then what we wanted to do is we wanted to keep on looping back around and trying again. So we're going to put continue. So what will happen here is it will ask what's the patient's temperature. It'll prompt you to put something in. If it's a number, then it will get converted using this float function, and temperature will now be a float data type. Then it won't have an exception, and then we have this break statement here. So then it will end and it has temperature stored. Whereas if it's not able to convert that into a number, it will tell you that's not a valid number, please enter a number, and it will keep on looping around until you do. The final bit for this little loop here is that we just put an else statement. So basically, if it tries it and it is true, then it'll go on to the else, and what the else asks it to do is to break. So that's how you can stop this infinite loop, because if it's a while true, it's going to keep on going forever until we break it. So we've got that break statement. So now let's demonstrate that. So it's asking what is the patient's temperature, and we're going to say 37, which is a number it should be able to turn into a float. So then it stops. And what has it done? It's assigned that to the variable temp. So if we now type in temp, then it brings up that number of 37. So as we then progress, we know that in that variable it has the number 37. Now let me show you what happens if I don't enter a number. Let's say I decide to just enter a couple of letters, IJ. It's going to say that is not a valid number, please enter a number, and it will keep on asking me, and I can type whatever I want to write until I enter a number. So let's say I enter 100, because to be fair, it hasn't specified centigrade, so in Fahrenheit that's a reasonable number, but it will now have converted that into our variable temp, which we can then go and work forwards with. So that's really it. So I know there's quite a lot going on here, there's a lot of different things happening, but essentially that statement will now enable us to take in that first variable, and we're going to use a similar sort of function for the remaining 4 variables. But before we move on to those, I want to do the next step, which is to calculate the SIR score based on this temperature score. So firstly, we're going to print out what the temperature score is. And the way we can do this again is just with a print statement, and we can say that the temperature is, and then because we have that variable which is temp, we can add that into this statement here, and we can say that the temperature is 100. And we can run this again, give a more sensible temperature, and it's 37, and let's say the temperature is 37. But what do we want to do with this? Well, this is a SIRS calculator, so the next step that we're going to take is to write a function which takes in that temperature. It decides whether it meets the criteria and whether or not you should get an extra point for your SIRS score. And what we're going to do for that is something called an if loop. So this is actually a little bit simpler than the previous ones. Essentially what an if loop does is you give it a statement, and if that's true, it will execute one thing, and if not, it will execute the other. So here we are interested in if temperature is greater than 38.5 or temperature is less than 37.5, because sorry, no, that's wrong. If the temperature is above 37.5 or less than 36.5, because the normal range is 36.5 to 37.5. So what this will do is if either of those statements are true, we can then ask it to increase the SIRS score. And the way that we increase the SIRS score is just simply by having our SIRS score variable, and we just want to increase it by 1, and we can do that like this by just doing plus equals 1, and that will increase the SIRS score up. And one thing that's pretty nice about Python is actually just how intuitive some of these statements are. So in other languages, you sometimes need to use more complicated things to mean or, and that sort of thing. Whereas here, we're actually just, you can actually just write the word or, you can do the same for and that sort of thing. So it makes it pretty intuitive. What we're gonna do if that's not true, then we use our else statement, and what our else statement does is it says, we'll print out the temperature is normal, let's just go with points, and then return the SIRS score. And actually, let's add a little statement in here saying points SIRS score. Okay, so let's now try that out. So we're going to print the score 37, that's a normal temperature, and the points are 0, and that's fine. And one thing also actually is, I saw the points is 0.0, and that's currently because it's a float and not an int. So if we want to make that an int, we can go back, turn it into 0, and now it should be an int, sorry, and not a float. So now if we recalculate this, point is now 0 rather than 0.0, and we don't really want it to be 0.0 because it doesn't make too much sense. So that's really the template that we're going to use for this entire function. If you have already been coding along, then that's great. If not, have a go now and try and write this function and see if you can get it to work yourself. Try and test yourself and see if you're able to write it without referencing the video and looking at the code. But of course, if you do need a hand, feel free to skip back in the video and use that as sort of template code. And then in a second, we're going to look at then writing the same sort of code for the remaining 3 functions and calculating an overall final score. Okay, so we've got our initial calculation for temperature. So essentially, we're just going to do a pretty similar thing for the next few steps. And when you're coding, there's no point reinventing the wheel. So we're actually just going to copy and paste this code and then modify it appropriately. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select these cells, Control-C, Control-V, copy and paste. And now we are going to loop through, but rather than temperature, we are going to calculate the respiratory rates and calculate whether that's normal or not. Let me just tidy things up a little bit up here. Okay, and I'm going to remove this because we now have these 2 cells doing all the functions that we need. So, what things do we need to change? Well, the first thing we need to change is the variable name, and we're going to change that to resp_rate, short for respiratory rate, and then we're going to copy that through so that all the relevant variables that we then go on to work with have been updated appropriately, and this one I'm going to change in a second. So now the input, rather than asking what's the patient temperature, we're going to ask what's the patient's respiratory rates. Now, interesting point. So with temperature, we were interested in something that had a decimal place, because temperature is usually reported as like 36.6 or 37.3. It's not the case with respiratory rate, so we actually want a full number. So what exactly, we actually want a full number. So what are we going to do? Well, what we can do is change this float function into an int function, and that's now going to turn it into an integer, or at least it's going to see whether we can. Of course, if it can't turn it into an integer, then it will print this statement, and now we're going to say, let's add in, that was not a valid whole number, please enter a whole number, because we're interested in a whole number. But otherwise, this while loop should be the same. So if we now run that, what's the patient's respiratory rate, and we say 20, it's going to store that in the variable resp rate, and if we were to call that, then it would come back with 20. So we have calculated our resp rate, but there's something else we also need to do, which is to calculate our PaCO2, because if we look at our reference criteria, there's another thing that is considered at the same time as resp rate, and that is PaCO2. So we're going to define that as a variable, and again, we're going to use the input function, and we are going to ask what is the patient's PaCO2, and again, same sort of function here. And just to specify, we're using millimolars of mercury, millimeters of mercury rather, so let's specify that in our question. And again, we want an int. What else do we need to change? Of course, we need to change our variable so that it is trying to convert the right thing. And again, we'll have this loop if it is not returning a correct value. So now it should, that is failing because of the indent, I think. Yes. And that's one thing with writing code, is you just kind of come to realize what some of the common errors are. And every time you notice it, you should become a bit quicker for the next time. So here, what is the patient's respiratory rate? So again, let's say 20. And sorry, we need to actually introduce a new while loop, while true, because that previous while loop has been broken and we don't want a capital letter there. So now let's try again. So 20, and then what's the PaCO2? Let's go with 36. So now we have our scoring system, and we got up to here. So if the respiratory rate is more than 20, I believe, or if the PaCO2 is less than 35, sorry, less than 32, then we're going to add one to our SIR score using the same function we did before. And otherwise, we are going to say not the temperature, but the respiratory rate, and the PaCO2 is normal, so therefore the points should stay the same. So now let's test that. Temperature is 20. Sorry, not the temperature. Again, let's update this variable. So the respiratory rate is this, and then we can say and the PaCO2 is, and then we enter the variable there. And yeah, that's fine. So now, respiratory rate is 20, PaCO2 is 36. Let's say both, we can just go with both are normal. Both are normal. And then the points are 0. So we're still on 0 because our temperature and everything else has been normal. So again, same sort of principle for the last two. If you want to, now pause the video and have a go at coding that if you can from memory, but feel free to reference the video if you're not too sure. And for the last two, it should be a bit quicker because we're just going to copy it, copy and paste. And actually, rather than copying and pasting respiratory rates, I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste temperature, because that's a little bit closer to exactly what we're trying to make. No, that's not worked. So let's copy temperature. Again, copy and paste. And we're going to, what we're going to do now, respiratory rate, temperature, heart rate. So while true, what's patient's heart rate? We are going to call this heart rate. We're going to update the variables appropriately. And again, we're going to want to use int because we want a whole number. That was not a valid number, please enter a number. Fine, and then the heart rate is, and then heart rate. And for this criteria, we want heart rate to either be above, I believe it's 90 or below 60. No, it's actually just above 90. So then is everything else fine? The heart rate is normal, points fine. So then that's basically the same. Let's just run that to check. Sorry, so let's say 94. So we actually should get a point for this. And here we do, the heart rate is 94, points is 1. And finally, the last of the criteria is white cell counts. So let's go ahead and code that. So while this is true, we'll call it WCC for white cell counts. Reallocate the variables. Here we're going to go over float because white cells can be decimal place. And so what is the patient's white blood cell count? Blood cell count. That was not a valid number, please enter a number. Fine, actually here let's put please enter a whole number. And finally the white cell counts. Sorry I'm making so many errors. This is because I'm standing up while typing and the angle affects me, or maybe I'm just making excuses. So white cells more than 12 or white cells less than 4. I believe it's the criteria, let's check. Yes, 12 and 4. And one other thing to specify is the units. So here we're going to do times 10 to the 9 per liter. So then when we report the score, the white cell count is, we can recall it as that. And then we can say the white cell count is normal if it is, and print the SIRS score. If not, then we're going to print here. So let's now run through this code. White cell count, let's say it is 15. And then we print, and so it is high, so it gives us a score of 2. So we've now got all the 4 variables we're going to take into our calculator. The final section is to report the final results. And what we're going to do here is we're going to say the total SIRS score is, and we're going to return the SIRS score. Well, I guess to some extent we have already returned that. And we're going to use another handy if statement, and what this if statement is going to do is it's going to say whether or not this meets the criteria for SIRS or not. If the score is 2 or above, then it does. If not, then the patient doesn't have SIRS. So have a go at doing that before I do, if you want to test yourself. Greater than or equal to 2, so that's a greater than or equal to statement. If the SIRS score is greater than or equal to 2, then print the criteria for SIRS are met, the patient has SIRS. And then we'll go with else. The criteria are not met, the patient does not have SIRS. Okay, so this score is 2, which means that the criteria are met and the patient does have SIRS. And now we have written our SIRS calculator. So let's run through it and make sure everything works. So it starts out by printing welcome to the calculator. We define the variable SIRS score as equal to 0. We use our while loop with our try except statement to ask what the temperature is. Let's say this patient has a temperature of 38.2. We're going to print that out and say that actually now there is a point for that. We're then going to check the respiratory rate. If the respiratory rate is normal and the PCO2 is also normal, then we print that out and it's going to tell us they're both normal. Same for heart rate. What's the patient's heart rate? Let's go with 94. And they've got another point for that. The white cell count is 8, which is normal, as we're told. And finally, the total SIRS score is 2, so the criteria is met, this patient has SIRS. Now, what we can do is we can actually take all of this code and put this into a Python file. So right now we've been working in a Jupyter Notebook. We can put it into a Python file, which we can then call, and that will basically work through all of this code without us having to call each of the cells individually. And I actually already did that earlier. So I demonstrated it at the start of this video, and this is what it looks like. So I can go into the terminal, and I can see that I have this function here, sirscalculator.py. And if I decide to open my Python shell by using Python, calling Python 3, I'm now in the shell, and I can import the sirs calculator. And actually I need to import the function within that. So let's go with from sirs calculator. Don't worry too much if you don't follow exactly what I'm doing here. It's just to demonstrate the principles. So from sirs calculator, import calculate sirs, I believe is the name I gave the function. And now what we can do is we can call our function calculate sirs, and it'll walk us through. So what's the patient's temperature? 37. What's the patient's heart rate? 91. What's the patient's respiratory rate? 21. What is the PCO2? 38. And what is the white blood cell count? 9. And it will tell us that the white blood cell count is normal, points are 2, total score is 2. The patient has met the criteria for sirs. So essentially what this file looks like is, it's just all of our code in this notebook, but instead we've put it inside of a function which is called calculate sirs, and when you call this function, it just runs through all of our code together, like you just saw, and that's something that then we can just call as one function all together. And actually, just to kind of help with some of the intuition, and to wrap up the video here, we could actually also now use that in our notebook. So if we run the code here, so import, what did we call it? Sirs calculator. Yes, sirs calculator, and also from sirs calculator, import calculate sirs. Now, if we simply call this function, it's going to run through the same thing. So welcome to the sirs calculator. What's the patient's temperature? 37.8. And you've seen this all before. It does the same sort of thing. So that is how to code a medical calculator using Python. I hope you were able to follow along mostly. If there were bits you weren't too sure about, feel free to stop the video or rewatch certain parts of the video. And in general, a really useful way to learn coding, if there's something that you see and you're not too sure about it, is just to Google it and try and find a good article on it that just explains exactly what that function is. And just every time you use that function, you'll have a more concrete understanding of it, and gradually things will come together and you will be able to write your own scripts like this and modify scripts and that sort of thing. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't yet, try and code this out as well yourself. Try and mix it up, write your own medical calculator for some sort of other application. If you do end up doing that, then leave a link in the description below and let me know. I'd love to check through that, and if you want me to check through the code as well, I'm very happy to and to give feedback on that. A couple of things also to say, the template code that I've written here, I will upload onto my GitHub. So if you look at the link in the description below, you'll be able to look at that code and use that as a template. And as I said, there is an accompanying blog post for this series, so feel free to check that out as well. And I want to give a huge shout out to Harvinder Power, who designed this exercise and wrote the initial code for it, which I modified very slightly for the purposes of this exercise. And he's also the founder of CodeMD, which is a website with lots of different tutorials like this, which I would definitely recommend checking out. So what have we learned? We have learned how to create a medical calculator. We've learned about variables. We've learned about different types of data and different types of variables. We've learned about while loops, try and except statements. We learned about using if and else statements, and we learned about how to print out our results. And most importantly, we made something that could genuinely be useful as a medical calculator. Now, if anybody's worked with electronic health records, essentially the same sort of code is going to be executed on those computers in order to calculate people's observations and vital signs and SIRS scores and any sorts of criteria that they have on these medical computers. So you've now written some code that probably looks pretty similar to the code that is behind the scenes at various different hospitals around the world. Now, if you're able to code this and you're looking for a new challenge, one thing that you could also try and do is to make it so that it will not accept unrealistic answers. So for example, when it asks the temperature, at the moment, if I said it was 1,000 degrees, it's going to accept that. But what you could do is you could write in a statement, you could modify this so that actually it will only accept it if the temperature is in a reasonable range, let's say above 34 or something and below 40, let's say, or below 41, 42. So then it would only accept it if that was the case, and otherwise it's going to ask you to re-enter the statement. So if you're interested, have a go at trying to write that as well. If you want to do something else, then feel free to check out any of the other videos on different coding tutorials. They'll all be linked in the description. And I hope you found that somewhat useful or interesting. I'll see you in the next video.